On behalf of the officers and directors of the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today, our justices, the members of the society, and guests. It's a happy birthday. Please don't sing. It's a happy birthday for the society because today is the 24th anniversary, the very day on which the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society was founded and authorized as a Michigan nonprofit corporation. Its founder was Dorothy Comstock Riley, who was then the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, and came upon the fact that there didn't seem to be much order or much purpose to the maintenance of the history of the Michigan Supreme Court. And so she decided that in order to preserve what history there was, in order to protect it, we should try to form a society whose main goal it would be to collect memorabilia and to try to do things that would memorialize the society. One of those important things, of course, was its portraits, and the society now has 88 portraits of former justices of the Michigan Supreme Court. They're all cataloged, they're all digitized. We have a fire, we can reproduce them. And they're all maintained by the society with your help and with the help of your dues. And we do that continually by upgrading them, by refinishing them. They have to be cleaned. The job is a little easier now that people don't smoke. It used to be that you had to clean them every so often because they accumulated from the smoke. So our job is to maintain those portraits, and we do that. We also do the presentation of portraits. Last October, we presented the portrait of former Chief Justice Clifford Taylor, Jr. And next week, on Wednesday, at the Hall of Justice at 3:30 in the afternoon, we're going to present the portrait of the Honorable Conrad Mallett, Jr. You're all invited to come to that. There'll be a number of people there who will be speaking, including former Governor Blanchard. Dungan will speak, Dennis Archer's going to speak, and of course Justice Mallett will be there with all of his supporters. And the portrait, which has been painted of him, which will be presented and then hung in the Hall of Justice. We had a board meeting this morning. We attended to the usual business of the board. It was well attended. And I want to now ask those members of the board to stand and be recognized for the work that they do for your society. Please stand. I'm going to give special recognition to a new board member, John Fedinsky. John's with the Attorney General's office, and if John, stand up. If you were here 2 years ago, you heard John as our main speaker, who gave a talk on his book, and the book that he wrote was a story about his trips through time through the 83 courthouses at the 83 counties in Michigan. It's a good book. It's still in print. You should get it and read it because it's not only in print, but there are pictures of each of the courthouses in Michigan. And it's an interesting collection because it shows you how people treated the center of their county throughout the years and what they did in the small towns and the larger towns in designating as the center of town and the court, those courthouses. Another thing, the program that we do in the society is we give student scholarship awards. And I see that we have present today 2 prize winners, Lee Coppage from UD Mercy and Sarah Primrose from Michigan State College of Law. Would you two stand up and let the group see you? The work of the society is in great part supported by the membership dues and by our corporate sponsors. And if you've got a program, someplace out there you've got a program, and listed on the side of the program are the names of about a dozen of our corporate sponsors, including the permanent ones who all contribute annually to the society. And we thank them, and we thank all of you for your support. It's now my pleasure to present and to introduce to you the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, Robert P. Young, Jr., who will introduce the members of the court.
Thank you. On behalf of the Supreme Court, I welcome you to the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society Luncheon. Neither Justice Kavanaugh nor Justice Hathaway could attend the luncheon, but both send their regards. Justice Zara was here during the reception, but had to leave. I think his probation officer was calling. I want to recognize, however, the other justices present. Justice Markman and Justice Mary Beth Kelley. Now, ordinarily, one does this kind of introduction by seniority, but I have saved Justice Marilyn Kelley's introduction for last for special recognition. This is her 16th and final year on the court, which she served with dedication as a justice and Chief Justice. Today marks the last time she will attend one of these luncheons as a sitting justice, and I ask you all to join me in recognizing and thanking her today. We also have with us former justices. My personal favorite living justice is Justice Patty Boyle, who had the misfortune of mentoring me. It's not her fault. Chuck Levin, a lion on the court. Jim Ryan, one of the intellectual giants who went on to the Article III world. And of course, Betty Weaver. As Wally mentioned, Justice Mallett is not with us today, but as he mentioned, he is going to have his portrait dedication. I'm told this time the paint is dry, and he will go forward with the presentation. I apologize in advance because I have to leave very shortly, so I will be unable to hear today's keynote presentation on the disgraced Justice Swainson. However, I wanted to add a few words of my own about Swainson before I have to leave. Obviously, Swainson represents a very sad and disturbing chapter in the court's history, one that we pray will never recur. History counsels us to avoid the mistakes of the past. James Joyce, the Irish novelist, wrote that history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. And certainly the Swainson matter was one of the court's most nightmarish moments. And although he was acquitted of bribery, it was his conviction on the 3 counts of perjury, including his denial that he received a TV set from Harvey Wish, the go-between in the alleged bribery scheme, that brought Swainson low and stained the court's reputation. Among other things, Swainson denied under oath having received the TV set. Unfortunately for him, he was filmed putting it in the trunk of his car. Swainson's justification for lying was that he sought to avoid revealing that the TV was a gift for his mistress. Now, perhaps this explanation satisfied his wife, but the jury convicted him as a perjurer. There are few worse low points in Michigan judicial branch history, but among them are the startling 1986 suicide of Court of Appeals Judge Jerome Bronson, who shot himself after being charged with accepting a $20,000 bribe. In 1983, Evan Callanan, senior judge of the 18th District Court in Westland, was convicted of charges related to a bribery scheme. And there are the comparatively lesser but still shameful instances of judicial dishonesty. In January, our court removed from office a Jackson area judge, James Justin, for, among other things, fixing traffic tickets for himself, his family, and staff, and lying under oath to the Judicial Tenure Commission. A little earlier, we removed Lansing Judge Beverly Nettles Nickerson from office, in part because she too lied under oath. These cases all carry their sad freight of personal shame and the public trust betrayed. We try to comfort ourselves by saying these things almost never happen, and yet when they do, how terrible the consequences. It is one thing, as bad as it is, to have an ill-tempered judge on the bench, or one who is habitually behind in his caseload, or constantly at war with his colleagues. But it is quite another to have a judge who engages in criminality, who commits perjury, who displays a calculated disregard for the law, as we observed in the Justin case. If a judge does not recognize the line between justice and criminality, then what do we hope we have in a society in general that will not cross that line? When judges flout the law, then by what authority other than force do we say that others must follow it? This court has been tough on judges who flout the law, and deservedly so. We cannot tolerate lawlessness among the lawgivers. That refusal to tolerate judges who flout the law is also part of the Michigan Supreme Court history, and will, God willing, always be a part of its character. The perjury convictions of Justice Swainson represent one of the bitterest episodes in the modern Supreme Court history. May we never experience its like again. In concluding, I would like, on behalf of the court, to extend all of our thanks to the members of this society for all of your wonderful work in preserving the court's history. Thank you very much.
It's now my pleasure to call for rebuttal, if you will, Attorney General Frank Kelley, affectionately known by all of us as the Eternal General, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
I don't make very many public appearances anymore. So I'm kind of grateful for President Wallace Riley. He asked me to be here today to introduce the speaker. Gives me a chance to rebut the rumor that I was passed away 2 years ago. You know? It is true that my family bought a plot on Mackinac Island. So it's also true that I own a plot on Mackinac Island. But look at me. I'm the only property owner you'll ever meet who has property on Mackinac Island and is not anxious to move in. But I'm glad to be here, glad to be anywhere. It's a pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. After graduating from Wayne State University, earning a Bachelor of Arts with distinction, and succeeded by graduating from the University of Michigan School, this young man was engaged by me to serve as an Assistant Attorney General for 7 fine years. Then in private practice for a few years, he became Special Counsel and Chief Legal Advisor to Governor James Blanchard. Both he and Governor Blanchard served as Assistant Attorneys General with me in the late 1960s. In 1987, he began service as a circuit judge in Ingham County, serving with distinction from 1987 until 2003. He then authored the book Wounded Warrior, about the life of Michigan Governor John B. Swainson. The work received the Independent Publisher 2011 Gold Medal as the best biography published by a university or independent press. The effort also received a 2011 Michigan Notable Book Award from the Library of Michigan. Most recently, our guest was appointed by Governor Snyder to the Michigan Board of Ethics. In addition to what has been a most successful career, I want to inform you that Lawrence Larry Glazer is not only a fine lawyer and jurist and writer, but he's also a man that you're glad to know, as I've known him in warm friendship for almost 50 years. Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker, Lawrence Glazer.
Thank you. Thank you, Attorney General Kelley, for your gracious introduction. Let me just adjust this here. Am I audible?
That microphone is
There we go. Okay, thank you.
that's the camera mic.
Okay. I was on Frank Kelley's staff over 30 years ago, but on occasions such as today, I feel like sometimes that I've never left it, especially when we were driving down here today, reminiscing about some of the old times. I want to thank Mr. Riley for inviting me to speak to you today. It's a very distinguished audience, and I'm having some difficulty not being intimidated, but I hope that we will struggle successfully with that. I also want to recognize Justice Steve Markman today. Justice Markman and I, when he was on the Court of Appeals, served together when I was a visiting judge on the Court of Appeals, and at that point I got to know him and Judge Mark Kavanaugh, and we later continued our acquaintanceship. And I have never forgotten a Michigan Judicial Association annual meeting at which Justice Markman gave probably the most scholarly and clear presentation on a point of constitutional law that I ever saw, and I always hope that I would be able to meet that standard. I fear that I haven't quite succeeded, but this book is probably as close as I'm going to be able to come. Now, it was mentioned that Conrad Mallett's portrait is going to be presented next week, and I expect to be there. Conrad Mallett and I are also old friends. This is an old tradition on the Michigan Supreme Court. And early on, when I was researching this story and still hadn't made up my mind whether to write a book or something shorter, I came across the portrait presentation to former Justice John Swainson, which took place in 1984. It was transcribed and published, of course, in the Michigan Report. And his supporters came and said nice things about him, and at the end of the ceremony, the former justice got up and responded. And the last thing he said, after expressing that he was satisfied with his life and happy, he said, and this is a direct quote, "I will let history, of which I have become quite fond, be the judge of my public career," end quote. Well, I was reading that statement 22 years later, and nobody had written anything significant about John Swainson. And in fact, he was gradually disappearing from public memory. They had even closed the little memorial room in the library for him in his adopted hometown. And it was clear that no, that John Swainson was not going to be the subject of history unless I did it myself. And so that's really when I committed to write the book. Now, John grew up in Port Huron and graduated from high school in 1943. In 1944, he enlisted in the Army and was sent to France as an infantryman. And as I think most of you know, in November of 1944. His lower legs were both destroyed when a landmine, anti-tank mine, was run over by the Jeep that he was escorting, and the Jeep was filled with munitions, which also went off. So he ended up in several hospitals in France and England, and then finally was transported back to the United States. And he was sent to a place which is now largely forgotten, but during the era when it was still active, was the largest facility of its kind in the world. I refer to Percy Jones Hospital in Battle Creek, Michigan, which received wounded service people during World War II and after, and was closed in the 1950s. And such people of future distinction as Phil Hart, Daniel Inouye, and John Swainson and Bob Dole all passed through that hospital after suffering grievous wounds in World War II. The formative experience of John Swainson's life was not his wounding in France, but his recovery in Battle Creek. They had a system which had evolved in which what we might call the upperclassmen, the guys who got there first, kind of took control over and mentored and tough-loved the guys who came in next. Swainson never forgot that. He thought it was one of the keys to his recovery. He did eventually recover the ability to walk with artificial legs, such that if you weren't looking for it, you would never have noticed that he was anything but a natural-legged man. It was also at that hospital that he met for the first time people from very different backgrounds. He grew up, as I say, in Port Huron, which was a mostly Caucasian town, and he met there African Americans and Japanese Americans. In fact, one of his best friends at the hospital was what we call a Nisai warrior, a Japanese American whose family was interned by the United States government, but who went and volunteered to fight in Europe and had both of his legs also destroyed. After that experience, one of the things that John Swainson began to do and did the rest of his career, whether he was a governor or circuit judge or Supreme Court judge or retired, was whenever he would hear that someone had just had an amputation, he would go unannounced to that person's home or hospital if they were still in the hospital and have a talk with that person. He would show the person his own legs and his own abilities that he had mastered, and would basically say to the person something like this: if you want to just stay in your room the rest of your life, society will take care of you, but you have another choice. And I want you to make sure you understand that you have a choice and you need to make a choice, because your other choice is to get to work, to master the ability to get around your disability, and then go out and do whatever you want to do in life, because you can achieve just about anything in spite of the disability. A lot of the people he talked to took him up on it. They were convinced by him. Not everyone, but most. And as I say, he did this without any publicity. No press were ever notified. And in fact, as far as I was able to discover, there was only one photograph that even exists of such a visit. After Swainson mastered the art of walking on the artificial limbs, he went to law school at the University of North Carolina, came back and took the Michigan bar exam, and on the day of the admission ceremony, met Frank Kelley, and they became fast friends and were friends ever after. John started to practice law in the Detroit area, and the Democratic Party at that time was looking for people to run as candidates, people whose patriotism could not be questioned, because it was roughly the time of the McCarthy era. John Swainson, of course, was such a person, and he agreed to run for the state senate from the Plymouth area, and he was elected as a Democrat. He spent 4 years in the Senate and became minority leader. And then during G. Mennen Williams' late part of his gubernatorial career, John Swainson was selected to be his lieutenant governor candidate and was elected to that position in 1958. In 1960, G. Mennen Williams decided not to run for re-election as governor, which set off a struggle among contenders. And the major two contenders really were John Swainson and Jim Hare, who had been Secretary of State of Michigan for a long time and had a very large organization of managers to help finance and run his campaign. And he was the favorite. However, he was upset by Swainson. And Swainson then took on and also upset Paul Bagwell, the Republican candidate, in the general election. So he was elected to a 2-year term in 1960. Back then, that's what the Constitution provided. Well, could I have a glass of water? Oh, right here, thank you. Okay. And 2 years is not a long time, and there's a long learning curve. And unfortunately, John was not able to quite master the job. He was up against difficult odds. Both houses were held by the opposing party in very large majorities. In spite of that, he came very close to enacting an income tax in Michigan, which was sorely needed and was finally achieved by George Romney, who beat him in 1962. Swainson then entered private practice, but he really wasn't particularly happy doing private practice. He liked being in the action of government and politics. And when a seat on the Wayne County Circuit Court opened up, he ran in a special election in 1965 and ended up being the only candidate. This was during a brief period when judicial vacancies were filled by special elections instead of gubernatorial appointments. John Swainson then served 6 years on the Wayne County Circuit Bench. Now, at this point I have to tell you that although he was blessed with many gifts, including intelligence, charm, articulateness, he also had some deficits. And one of those deficits was the inability to make a judgment when approached by a person who professed friendship. Somehow, to John Swainson, all those people were the same. They were all worthy of acceptance. And unfortunately, as many of you know, especially those of you who held public office, sometimes you're approached by people who profess friendship but actually have other goals to advance. So while he was a circuit judge, he got to know this bail bondsman named Harvey Wish. And Harvey Wish would do little favors for him, try to help him pick up packages and deliver things for him because of his disability. And of course, in any large urban court, bail bondsmen always would like to have the friendship and support of as many judges as possible, and this is certainly one of Harvey Wish's motives. In 1970, John Swainson decided to run for the Michigan Supreme Court, and he and G. Menon Williams were nominated by the Democratic Convention, and each of them was elected. At that time, when they took office in 1971, their colleagues were T. Matthew Cavanaugh, a former Attorney General of Michigan and a Democrat, T. Giles Cavanaugh, a former Court of Appeals judge and a Democrat, Paul Adams, a former Attorney General of Michigan and a Democrat, Eugene Black, a former Attorney General who began as a Republican but then was nominated by the Democratic Party, and incidentally was the last person to serve on the Michigan Supreme Court, never having gone to law school. He read law in a law office the old-fashioned way, like Abe Lincoln. And finally, the youngest colleague was Tom Brennan, the only Republican-nominated person on the court. It was a pretty collegial group of people, and they got along reasonably well. Obviously, Tom Brennan disagreed with them more than they disagreed with each other, but as Brennan put it, we always were able to disagree agreeably. So they worked together. And in the 5 years that John Swainson was on that court, he authored 60 majority opinions and 10 dissents. It was a pretty liberal court, as you can imagine, and those were much more liberal times politically than the times we live in now. And in addition, the court, like all state appellate courts, had the job of implementing the Warren Court's decisions. So even courts that weren't particularly liberal probably would have appeared a little more so in that era than they do today. Now in 1972, a professional burglar named John Whalen, who was also an FBI informant, was appealing a burglary conviction. The Court of Appeals had affirmed that conviction. And so he went to his bail bondsman, Harvey Wish, and was talking about what to do next. And Harvey Wish said, well, I have a friend on the Supreme Court. But I think for $20,000, we can probably get you a dismissal. Quote, dismissal, unquote. John Whalen thought that was probably a better gamble than just using a regular attorney in appealing. But he also wanted to take out an insurance policy. So he also went to the FBI, told the FBI what he had been told by the bail bondsman, and agreed to be wired by the FBI in all his future conversations with that bail bondsman, in return for the FBI's promise that he would never have to serve the sentence from which he was then appealing. Now, if some of you are saying, wait a minute, how could the FBI do that? The answer is they can't. But apparently the agents who did it didn't know that, and John Whalen, the burglar, certainly didn't know it. So they wired him, and they heard him and taped him talking to the bail bondsman, Harvey Wish. And occasionally they would follow Harvey Wish when they thought he might be seeing John Swainson. And on one occasion they followed Harvey Wish to Schweitzer's restaurant. And after the two had lunch, a television set was indeed transferred from Wish's car to Swainson's car. And that was about it. There was no real proof of anything. Whalen's conviction was reversed. But they really didn't have much evidence that there was any nefarious business behind that. Then in 1972, a person named Robert Ozer arrived to take over what was called the Organized Crime Strike Force in Michigan. Mr. Ozer was very, very aggressive, probably the most aggressive federal prosecutor at that time in the United States. He was also not afraid of getting close to the boundary of ethics, and on several occasions went over that boundary. He was ultimately fired as head of the task force. And after that, in two other government positions, he was cited for breach of ethics. Now, nothing had happened in this investigation beyond what I've told you for 3 years. And Ozer decided that he was going to subpoena John Swainson to testify before a grand jury. The Justice Department doesn't do that anymore. It's against their policy to subpoena a target to testify. But at that time, it was not against policy, although it was pretty rare. Swainson had no idea what he was going to be asked about. But he hired an attorney. He purposely hired an attorney with no criminal experience because he didn't want people to think he had anything to hide. He was a very good civil attorney, but hiring him for this particular job turned out to be a mistake. Ozer put Swainson before the grand jury and asked him a series of specific questions, very specific questions, about events that had taken place 2.5 years before, particular conversations, particular meetings, and yes, the television set. Swainson essentially said, I don't remember any of those things. But with regard to the television set, he said, no, I don't remember that, and I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. That didn't happen. So Ozer then produced the testimony of an FBI agent and a parking lot attendant who had seen the TV set transferred from the trunk of Harvey Wish's car, the bail bondsman, to the trunk of Swainson's car, which of course they interpreted as a bribe or as part of a bribe. Swainson went home that day and called his staff members and attorneys together, and they all went through all the records of his appointments to try to figure out what had been going on the dates that the grand jury was interested in. And they pretty much established what had happened, and so he came back and testified 2 days later again, voluntarily, to correct his testimony. But he never mentioned having gone over the appointment books and so forth. He never mentioned why he didn't remember the television set. And yet, there was a very good reason why he didn't remember the television set. Now, I'm sorry to have to contradict the Chief Justice, but it just happens that there have always been a lot of rumors and hearsay stories about John Swainson, and you just heard one of them from the Chief Justice. All I can tell you is what I found in terms of credible eyewitness testimony and research. The reason he didn't remember it is, first of all, it was not a gift from Harvey Wish. Harvey Wish was delivering it for another person. This all came out at the trial by the testimony of witnesses who had no interest in one side or the other. Secondly, Swainson had not asked for the television set, did not expect it, and did not keep it. He gave it not to a mistress, but to his brother, who had just come home from the military. And that's why when they asked him, did you receive a television set from Harvey Wish? He said no, because he didn't keep it more than 2 hours. He didn't expect it, and it wasn't Harvey Wish's to give to him in the first place. Unfortunately, at the trial, his attorney used up all of his time in closing argument on the bribery charge and had almost nothing to say about this other charge. Also, unfortunately, at the trial, he didn't call any of the people, and I found 3 of them, who were at those meetings between his first and second grand jury appearance. None of those people were called, and they could have testified that John did not lie deliberately. He really did not remember any of these things. And we had to go through all of his diaries. Now you may think to yourself, well, maybe he was putting on an act. Okay, if he was putting on an act, why didn't he call these people as witnesses? Apparently it never occurred to his attorney, and it never occurred to him. So he was convicted of perjury. And thus began his downward slide. He was forced to resign from the Supreme Court because in Michigan you cannot serve in public state office if you've been convicted of a felony. He lost his law license. He descended into depression and alcohol abuse. And eventually he was convicted twice of driving under the influence of alcohol, and he hit bottom. He bottomed out. So he went into a rehab program, and it was successful, and he came back. He got his law license back after a total of 5 years, and he began to practice mediation. He became an historian of Michigan and gave speeches and wrote papers about Michigan history, and eventually, to his great delight, became the president of the Michigan History Commission. And that's why he said what he said at that portrait presentation. There's much, much more to the story. I wish I could tell you, but I think I have to let you go. And thank you very, very kindly. If you want to read more about it, there's a book.
There is a book. I'm holding in my hand. It's a great read. It's less than 300 pages. It goes from beginning to end, just as you heard. But I would certainly recommend you get it. You can get it from the local press. Amazon's the easiest, quickest way. Michigan State is the one that published it. They've got a special price of $20 for a hardcover book. You can get that, but get it and read it. And I think when you do read it, and incidentally, I knew John Swainson. I took the bar with him when he ran for circuit judge because it was an election. It was about the time that I was thinking of running for judge, and I put out some feelers. And I got a call from John Swainson. And John Swainson said, I just want you to know I'm running for judge. And I said, thank you, John, you've saved me a lot of money. He was elected unopposed. But he was well liked, and he was really a great guy. Made a mistake, yes, but it's a mistake that others might have made too. So get the book and read it. And then come back next year and we'll have another story for you. Thanks very much for coming.
Yeah.